This is Syria. Syria is often considered the cradle of humanity, with evidence of human existence as early as 700,000 years ago. Some of the earliest known civilizations were in what is now Syria. Syria was first controlled by the Semitic or Jewish kingdoms. Because of Syria's convenient location in the Fertile Crescent, the land that is now Syria was conquered and reconquered again by the Akkadians, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, the Arameans, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Umadians, the Obsidians, the Byzantines, the Turks, the Crusaders, the Mongols, the Ottomans, and finally, the French. After the Crusades, the land was swallowed up by the Ottoman Empire, and from the 1300s until World War I, that's how things remained. After the war, however, the self-designated as superior Westerners decided to make the Middle East the way they wanted to. So, a couple of diplomats from the League of Nations sat down to scribble lines on a piece of paper, and of course, none of these people who got to decide who would live where actually lived in this area or knew enough about this area to really have a valid say in what should be what or who should have to live with who. Syria was drawn on a map, making it map official and given to the French to rule. Religion plays a huge role in the conflict in the Syrian civil war, and just like how there are many different ethnic groups in the country, there are just as many different religious groups, which adds to the conflict. Currently, Jews and Ismailis make up 2 to 3% of the population of Syria, Shiite Muslims and other minorities make up 5%, Christians make up 10%, Alawite Muslims 12%, and Sunni Muslims make up 70% of the population. As you can see, Syria is a country made up of many different people of many different ethnicities from many different places who practice many different religions. In fact, when the Mongols were invading Syria, they actually converted to Islam and just assimilated into the Syrian culture. Syria is a very diverse country with many individual groups who have very little tolerance for each other. In fact, the Sunni Muslims completely reject the Alawite Muslim religion as heresy and can legally kill Alawites. Religion is important to the conflict in Syria because the two major political parties in Syria are closely tied to the two major religions. The Muslim Brotherhood is the political party most strongly supported by the Sunni Muslims. The Muslim Brotherhood wants Syria to be an Arab nation-state populated by Orthodox Sunni Muslims with absolutely no regard for the other minorities within Syria. The other political party is closely tied to the Alawite Muslims. Called the Ba'ath Party, it stands for national unity, socialism, modern society, and religious freedom with a secular government. The Ba'ath Party was created on the hope that a society could be made that could disregard ethnicities and be united together as a country. These political ties make sense. The Alawite Muslims were typically from the poor, lower classes of society at the time, while the Sunni Muslims were usually the merchants and businessmen from the higher classes. The Ba'ath Party offered socialism to bring up the low-class Alawites and to pull down the Sunni Muslim aristocrats, so obviously it was an easy choice for both sides to make. The Alawites supported the Ba'ath Party, and the Sunni Muslims supported the Muslim Brotherhood. The Ba'ath Party was able to rise to power because its Alawite members were poor and joined the military for employment. This placed them in the perfect spot to lead a military coup and take over the country. And that is exactly what happened after decades of coup upon coup when Hafez Al-Assad became the president in 1971 by seizing the government. And as all dictators to be do, Hafez Assad named his party as the Syrian Party, eliminating any real political opposition. Because of Syria's recent history with military coups, no one thought that Assad was going to last any longer than anyone else had, but they couldn't have been more wrong. In 1973, Hafez Assad changed the constitution of Syria to formally recognize Alawite Muslims as a form of Shia Muslims, not heretics. This, of course, made the Muslim Brotherhood furious and riots broke out. When Muslim Brotherhood members protested in less than peaceful ways, using suicide bombs and car bombs to assassinate Assad's government officials and other Alawite civilians, Assad responded in a way that the country would never forget. In 1982, the city of Hama was quite nearly destroyed in conflicts between the Muslim Brotherhood and Assad's government forces, as Assad strictly wiped out the Muslim Brotherhood who were rebelling against him. Using torture, mass executions, and commando raids that killed mostly civilians, not Muslim Brotherhood, Hafez Assad was able to defeat the Brotherhood uprisings. One of the more brutal and horrific events that occurred in Hama under Assad's direction was a random selecting of 400 boys and men over the age of 14 and executing them. In the end, uprisings were defeated at the cost of 40,000 lives. When Hafez al-Assad died in 2000, his son Bashar Assad took power. Bashar envisioned a Syria very different from the reign of terror and totalitarian dictatorship that his father had ruled with. He took a more casual, friend of the people approach, wanting to be liked, not feared. He continued to modernize Syria with better technology and the internet and released some political prisoners that his father had held. But these changes were only on the surface, taking place only for the elite Alawites. The internet was censored and carefully watched, the secret police were ever present, the media was still government-controlled, and the freedom of expression was oppressed. And as opposition arose when needs were not met, Bashar Assad followed in the footsteps of his father and brutally struck them down. Brutally, but quietly. For years, opposition was eliminated quietly as to not raise doubts of Assad's leadership within the Ba'ath Party. They continued to support him without ever knowing what was happening to the oppressed majority. Assad's reforms were short and sweet, and he never addressed the request for political reforms. The people's call for a multi-party election was never answered as the Ba'ath Party continued to dominate in a single-party government. But then, Arab Spring happened. On March 15, 2011, teens in Dara painted "The People Want the Fall of the Regime" as protest. They were arrested, their parents protested, then arrested, some more people protested. These protests were taken to the streets as anti-government groups and pro-government groups violently clashed with each other in fights. The police and government forces eventually intervened, conveniently taking the job of the pro-government groups, and people were killed. More protesters came because they were even angrier now that people had died, so more government forces came to stop them. With more people shooting at more people to shoot at, more people died, and the cycle continued for months. The body count steadily rose over the months as protests became bigger and more frequent and military action became more swift. What began as protests calling for reform soon became armed rebellion forces and the start of a civil war as protesters abandoned all hope of reforms ever coming from peaceful demonstrations. A faction of the National Army broke off and formed the Free Syrian Army. This is the largest rebel group, but not the only one. There are several dozens of different rebel groups. We know some about some, but hardly anything about most of them. The Free Syrian Army defected from the National Army in July of 2011 and had between 1,000 and 25,000 by the end of that year. The FSA is the most effective group and uses mainly guerrilla warfare tactics. The FSA is made up of mostly Sunni Muslims and protects neighborhoods and small villages from Assad's forces while occupying them. However, the FSA is badly fragmented across the country and it has no center of command. They function in small units and are not at all in contact as a whole armed force. There are no directions or organization given from a higher command. Al-Nusra is an extremist Iraqi group. Al-Nusra is the most violent and aggressive group and is credited for 50 suicide bombings in just 2011. Al-Nusra is a terrorist group and is confirmed to be a part of Al-Qaeda. Al-Nusra and the Free Syrian Army have fought together, although the relationship is tense because the Free Syrian Army doesn't agree with their tactics or extremism. Al-Nusra is religiously intolerant, which does not work well at all with Syria's demographics. Al-Nusra has robbed Syrian factories for supplies, and being mostly foreign, this increases tensions between Syrians and Al-Nusra. Countless separate armed rebel forces are fighting the government across the country, but there is a distinct lack of unity between the groups, and it is costing the rebels greatly. There are many, many rebel groups, and some agree somewhat with each other, and others agree on nothing other than the fact that Syria would be better without Assad. But apparently that's just not enough to unite them. Joining forces would be extremely useful to the rebels, but they are unable to. Some of the rebel groups have conflicting political views or even opposing views that make them more enemies than friends. In Syria, the enemy of your enemy might just still be your enemy. Many of the rebel groups actually spend more time fighting each other instead of fighting Assad. Furthermore, even the strongest rebel forces have failed to organize themselves, making success even more difficult. And in the case of the Free Syrian Army, some smaller individual militias are taking up the flag and name of the FSA without ever telling the FSA that they are planning on doing so. This isn't a two-side revolution of blue coats versus red coats. This is a Crayola box-colored struggle for power. By late 2011, early 2012, rebel groups began capturing neighborhoods and towns for their own. This started the fight with Assad's government forces for control of this civilian land. This struggle continues today as the government military gains and regains again the land that the rebels have staked claim to. And with every gain of either side, civilians are caught in the crossfires and killed. By spring of 2012, Assad's forces were taking offensive actions to regain control of rebel-held areas. The typical tactic used by Assad was to bomb a rebel-held area for a few days with mortars and airstrikes, and then the National Army would roll in with tanks to fight what remained of the people and what remained of the city. Assad repeatedly used this tactic, but to what gains? Civilians were dead, which made Assad look bad from an international standpoint. By June of 2012, the death toll of the conflict was well over 10,000, and the United Nations officially declared Syria as being in a state of civil war. Thank you, United Nations. Throughout the rest of 2012 and 2013, various rebel forces, although mainly the Free Syrian Army, took offensives to gain more territory, and Assad with the National Army regained the territory back half destroyed in an endless game of chase through Damascus, Aleppo, Hama, and on throughout the country. And remember, this fighting isn't happening out of the way in fields like in the American Civil War or out of the way in trenches like in the World Wars. There is no "not in my backyard" in the Syrian Civil War because the territory gained by the rebels or Assad is neighborhoods, districts, cities, and villages. So not only are innocent civilians being caught in crossfires, but they are being killed by air raids, suicide bombs, barrel bombs, cluster bombs, mass executions by both sides, and yes, chemical weapons. Chemical weapons are different from explosives because of their effect. Explosives kill kinda quickly and everything is destroyed. Chemical and biological weapons, however, kill slowly and painfully and only kill. All infrastructure is left intact, which would be a huge advantage to a government force trying to reclaim territory and still be able to use it afterwards. Chemical weapons kill indiscriminately, wiping out every citizen, whether in rebellion or an innocent civilian, and there's no way to protect yourself. Chemical weapons have a far wider impact than any explosives used. The civilians have no defense against chemical weapons, and they are just way too convenient. You can hide from shrapnel, but not from the air we breathe. Chemical weapons are too nice for the user. They provide no disadvantages. So, America made a disadvantage: our involvement. Obama released a statement in 2012 setting a red line that must not be crossed by the Syrian government. The use of chemical or biological weapons would cross this line, and crossing it would bring American forces into the country. In August 2013, Assad used sarin gas on the people, which crossed the red line. But Americans didn't really want to be involved, nor did they know how to get involved. The red line turned out to just be an empty threat, but it did end up doing some good. During a debate in Congress about whether or not to get involved in Syria, Secretary of State John Kerry was reported saying that there would be no need for involvement if Assad would just hand over the chemical weapon. Russia thought this was a pretty great idea, and since they actually cared about Syria, they started negotiations with Syria over the chemical weapon. Russia loves Syria for many reasons, one being the Russian naval ports in the Syrian Mediterranean that Russia really, really needs in this convenient location. Warm water ports are important, and warm water is something that Russia just doesn't have. There are other economic reasons, such as Russia being Syria's biggest arms supplier. Russia gets millions of dollars in exports to Syria yearly. Also, ideologically speaking, Syria has become an extension of the Cold War. Syria is currently socialist under Assad, and the rebels would open a free market policy if they were to win the civil war. So obviously, Russia is supporting the national government to keep Assad in power and keep Syria socialist. Back to the chemical weapons, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has been made, and agreements with Russia, Syria, and the United States have begun. As of October 31st, 2013, all production facilities in Damascus were destroyed, and the steps have been taken to start dismantling all chemical weapons in Syria. But the fighting still continues in Syria, taking 150,334 lives as of April 1st, 2014, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. The UN gave up counting after 100,000 because of discrepancies in reports between the rebels and the government. Over 2 million Syrians have fled the country, and another 6 million are homeless refugees in their own country. But now you're probably wondering why it is that nothing has been done to help Syria. Well, the United Nations has tried to get involved, but Russia and China have been repeatedly vetoing any action to intervene in Syria. Although why China and Russia even have veto power in the first place is a mystery to everyone. So, then why doesn't America drop by to help? The United States doesn't need international approval to get involved with Syria, but United States intervention means picking a side, and none of the sides of this many-sided mess are appealing to the United States. Assad is a socialist dictator who has brutally murdered his own people, used chemical weapons after being directly told not to, and refused rights to the majority of the people in Syria, giving full rights only to the elite Alawite class. He ran Syria in corruption and refused to open the political system up to a multi-party democracy. So, then support the rebels. As previously mentioned in this video, there's a huge problem with that because of how many different rebel groups there are to choose from. There are literally dozens of separate rebel groups in Syria, all with different ideologies and different plans for Syria if they were to take power. Some are democratic, but some are definitely, without a doubt, Al-Qaeda supporters. Some will offer equal rights, but more are fighting for an Islamic state, refusing rights to minorities. And we know very little about these groups, and certainly don't know enough to support any of them. And besides, if we are going to give help on the merits of good deeds done, not a single group in the country could be found. Rebel groups have massacred Alawite civilians in the name of the revolution and as retaliation for being privileged while the Sunni Muslim majority was oppressed for decades. To add to this, many of the rebel groups are fighting each other on top of fighting the national government and Assad. So the United States is unsure of what would happen to these weapons if we were to supply them to the rebel forces of Syria. Who would end up with them and who would they kill? There would be no way to regulate where the weapons go, so people we really don't want to be armed could end up carrying U.S. weapons. And at the end of the day, if the rebels defeat Assad, which has become more and more unlikely over the last few weeks, who will take power and what will they do? Will Islamists take power? Will terrorists? Will a democratically minded military? Will Iraqi al-Qaeda supporters? Will Syria be enveloped into a second civil war to decide who takes power now? With all of these questions in mind, America stays put and doesn't do anything. We just don't know enough or care enough to get involved.